Okay, so this topic of evidence in policymaking is a critical one. As we all know, education systems tend to be national, but locally delivered, and the diversity of that local context has already been referred to in the questions. But also for that reason, and because they are such large employers of staff in their delivery, they tend to be very quickly highly politicised, as all of our panellists know very well. So this question of the role of evidence in that particular system is a critical one, and it's naturally one that preoccupies us at a place like this, where we spend a lot of our time gathering and analysing evidence and data. So I'm certainly really excited to hear from our panellists about their reflections on how they've experienced the use and indeed the generation of evidence to shape and sustain education policy, sometimes across different administrations in their countries. As I said, I will introduce the speakers as they speak, but to be fair to them, I'm just going to let them know that I intend to go Rukmini, David, Mark, and Mulekin, and then I'm delighted to have our discussants as well, Mr. Chowdhury. So that's the order that we'll go in. So let me begin. Rukmini needs little introduction. Many of you may have already been in sessions with Rukmini today, but Rukmini has a distinguished role in delivering education in India through Pradham and through her own extensive research. I think Rukmini and our work together on RISE, it was very clear that you brought together, as everybody knows, a wonderful mix of practice, application and research, and so it seems particularly appropriate to have you talking to us about how evidence plays a role in the work that you've undertaken over the decades of work that you've been doing in India in education. Please.
So, do I need a mic or?
So we just put one. We've got a handheld here that you could just hold if you find it easy. Please.
So I'm very happy to be on this panel with the men in black and blue. And please notice how they've put me on the margin, but that's okay. And then, since I don't know how many people here are from India, but on TV, they ask you a question, and then most people answer whatever they want to, completely ignoring the question. So true to my culture, I'll do that.
And true to mine, I'll limit you to 3 minutes.
So I think this role of evidence, and we've been talking about it for the last few days, both in London and today. And I think it's kind of interesting from where you look at what this is. And so in answer to your question, I'm going to just tell you a small story. There are some people in the audience who've heard this story ad nauseum. They can close their ears. But it's an actual event that happened some years ago. We were doing village report cards because we felt that part of the issue of understanding a problem is to participate in the process of generating some information on it. And this was almost before our national survey, which is called ASER, the annual status of education report, happened. So we did the way we did village report cards was that you use this, the simple tool we have, but you did it hamlet by hamlet, and after you did 1 or 2 kids, it's an assessment of, are you in school and can you read and can you do simple math? People in the hamlet would say, oh, this is easy, let me help. But the process starts by going to the village headman or headwoman and saying, I'm going to do this, just so that they know. So in this particular case, our village was a headman, and he was a very busy man, as village head people are. And he had a big kind of a livestock business, milk business, I think. So when I said, I introduced myself, I said, I'm going to do this. And he said, oh, survey, yeah, go ahead. People do surveys all the time. Did not even look up. So fine, I informed him. Whether he digested it or not doesn't matter. And then we spent the next 2 days, it was a large village, doing this exercise hamlet by hamlet. Because by that time we had realized that a whole village, forget about India, but a whole village is a big place. And people can't relate to data from some other part of the village. So doing it by hamlets made sense. So it was done, took 2-3 days, lots of people were involved. We came back to the village headman and said, can we tell you about it? He's continued to be very busy because, the milk business is a, very busy business. So he said, tell me where to sign. And on our little format, there was nowhere to sign because it wasn't going anywhere. So I said, there isn't anywhere to sign. And he said, what do you mean? Data goes up. We don't need data, we know where we are at. So I said, well, in this case, can I explain what we did. He said, okay, go ahead, it's a survey, right? I mean, the definition, by the way, from somebody else in another village of a survey was the things that you guys don't know and we have to tell you. So we know, you don't know. That's why you do surveys, okay? So I already knew this. So I said, this is about whether children are in school. He started like, I know how many children are in school in my village. I said, good. And his estimate was exactly right. Same thing was in our data. And so I said, well, out of those 100 children, by the way, 60 can't read. At that point, his eyes went off the buffalo and towards me and said, lies. Lies. I said, why? He said, nobody goes. I mean, I've seen many surveys in my village. Nobody goes to house. We have got a big village. You do a few, then you get tired, then you go to the tea shop and you fill up the rest. And then I sign and then you send it to your bosses. That's how it works. So at this point, I thought I should respond, and I have an ego as well. So I said, by the way, I'm the boss. He was not impressed. He said, if you're the boss, why are you running around from village to village? And then he said, I noticed you didn't even come in a car. So clearly, I'm not the boss, because I'm running around and I don't have a car. But it got his attention. So he said, this is lies, but people around said, no, we were part of it, so it's not lies. So then he said, it can't be true. There's a difference between lies and can't be true. Why cannot it be true? Because the whole problem that we are discussing for a decade now is that children are in school. Therefore, they must be learning. So how can it be that these kids have been in school and you're saying to me 60 out of 100 can't read? So I said, well, then he said, I don't believe it. So when you don't believe it, there's only one way to convince you. So I said, here's the tool. Do you want to talk to some kids? And he said, absolutely. So he went down the path in front of him. It wasn't a very particularly random selection of children, whoever he met. By the 6th kid, he put his hands up and said, oh my God, that there was such a big problem. And I am somebody who is interested in education. I support the village school, and I didn't know. But it took this whole drama for this evidence at that very last level to have any effect, after which he did many things. But every time I talk about evidence and its role in action, I'm always reminded that this data is looked upon, I mean, at least in the context in which I was, data is not for the village, it's usually false, it can't be believed, and it goes to some guy far away who really doesn't know much. And therefore, to expect that just because I've done a report or we've done a report, the whole world is going to read it, is, I think, misplaced. Because there needs to be some process by which this data and the reality can, come a little bit together. So that's my...
Wonderful.
Did I answer your question?
You did very well.
Okay, thank you.
Before you, let's swap seats with me. I'm challenged by your... Please sit here. Very good. Right. So from my marginal position as chair, I now want to introduce David Njeng'ere. David is the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya National Exams Council, and in that position has been responsible for conceptualising and designing the competency-based curriculum, drawing on his extensive academic research and experience. David, would you like to share your thoughts with us about the use of evidence in education policy making?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, a disclaimer, I wasn't coming to London for this kind of a session. I was coming for the Education World Forum, but the PS was unable to come. So I was asked to come and represent him. Initially, I was told there was a speech to come and read, only to arrive here and I was told there are some questions. So I've gone through the questions, but I didn't finish answering the questions. Keith took me to see Oxford. I think we need to, from my perspective, because I don't work for the ministry, I work for exams board, so whatever I say is not policy. That data is everything in as far as education is concerned. And you cannot do any planning in education without data. Sometimes we assume data does not exist, but in Kenya, in schools, there is a lot of data. Because every morning the children arrive in class, the first thing the teacher does is to mark a register and say who is present, who is not present. So at the school level, there is a lot of data, and data is collected every day. At the national level, we do have a system called NEMIS, National Education Management Information System. And all decisions are made using that system. The data is collected at the school level. Every school is expected to register the students or the pupils on that system. And at the national level, the capitation that goes to these students is based on that data. So the data is there. It's only a question of what do we do with that data? Do we use it effectively and efficiently to make decisions? As far as evidence is concerned, we have systems that help us to make decisions based on evidence. For example, we conduct a national assessment study every year at grade 3, and after every 3 years or so, we conduct a regional study called SACMEC that brings together several African countries. And some of the data that we collect using those two assessments speak to not just achievement in literacy and numeracy, but also learner characteristics, school characteristics, and teacher characteristics. And over the years, the evidence generated from those studies has been used to influence policy. For example, 4 years ago, the data from these studies showed that teacher and learner absenteeism was very high in the country. And using that evidence, the Teacher Service Commission came up with a policy that teachers, because the evidence was showing that teachers were spending a lot of their time in, for lack of a better word, capacity building programs, but some of them really were not quite capacity building programs. And teachers were spending too much time away from school. Learners too were spending too much time away from school. And so the Teacher Service Commission came up with policies to regularize all those capacity building programs. The other evidence that came up was that most parents were not participating in supporting the children to do their homework. And some of the evidence that emerged is that comparing how much time the mothers and fathers were spending with the children, fathers were spending very little time helping the children to do their homework. So when we were conceptualizing the competency-based curriculum, we deliberately included a component of parental empowerment and engagement to help the parents appreciate the importance of spending more time with their children. We also have evidence that emerged way back in 2016 on the issue of textbooks, because government was sending money directly to schools to buy textbooks. But when we collected data, we found that in most of the schools, the textbooks were not there, yet the money had been sent to the schools. So government changed policy and determined that procurement of textbooks is going to be done centrally. And today, if you go to any school in Kenya, you'll find that the textbooks are there. So in other words, what I'm saying is that the process of collecting data and generating evidence to inform policy is there. It's only a question of how much are we doing it? And are we doing it in the right way? So when I looked at the second question, I saw that that is why I'm supposed to answer it. So I don't want to answer the question now, so that I don't lose the marks for the second question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
thank you both. We're already starting to see in Rukmini's story and then in David's analysis data that's gathered in the community and then the data that's aggregated. And I think we may want to come to discuss that a bit further in our conversation. But let's hear from another member of our panelists. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Mark Adom Asoma. Mark from Ghana is a STEM policy advisor in the Ministry of Education. And it's a real privilege and pleasure to have you with us, Mark. Please share with us your thoughts on the use of evidence.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's time for another disclaimer. So I am a university professor. I teach engineering. So I'm the immediate past provost of the College of Engineering. The Minister for Education asked me to come and lead a STEM project for him. I was told, was it yesterday, Kate, that I had to be here. So forgive me, but I'll try my best. I'll do what is expected of me. So in 2015, a survey was undertaken in Ghana. And this survey came up with results that only 2% of all primary 2 students kids in public schools could read at least a word or so. That is, could read and understand. But let me also give a little bit of context to this. In Ghana, the middle class is moving away from public schools. So a lot of the kids are now getting into private schools, and the performance in the private schools are quite high. However, we are having this problem where those in poverty may remain in poverty forever. We have kids who go to school who do not have parents who are literate, who do not have parents who can supervise their homework. Therefore, this became more of an alarm to the nation. So in 2018, DFID, in conjunction with other groups, came up with a funding, and they started research on what we call the education sector report. The whole idea was to introduce a new education reform. Part of the background to this has been that industry has been complaining about the products being churned out, and therefore something needed to be done. The Education Strategy Plan 2018 to 2030 was launched. But before we could get into policies, it was very important for us to get some data. And this is where the education sector report comes in. With the education sector report, certain parameters came up, and these were some of the educational outcomes. So the education financing was done by the government of Ghana. Government of Ghana's input was about 80% of the budget. And then we have what we call the GET Fund, which also provided an annual budget to take care of goods, services, and capital investment. Then with regards to education management, we realized that we had teacher management issues and system issues. So with the teacher management issues, we dealt with teacher absenteeism and poor performance of teachers, etc. And with the system management, we realized that there was a problem in terms of system accountability. So it was important that we looked at schools inspections. We looked at the teacher unions and how they did their work. and we also needed to look at the curriculum. We also had issues with the basic education, where we have the KG primary and junior high school. The gross enrollment ratios were very high, meaning that access was high, but quality was low. And we needed to also have an idea of it. And we realized there was also weak education management, and there was no accountability. In secondary education, the gross enrollment ratio was found to be about 50%, with very low pass rates in core and elective mathematics and science subjects. Then we also have the technical vocational education and training, TVET, and that also came up with the fact that only 2.1% of all the students wanted to choose it on their own. So it means that there were very few people who wanted to do that, and there were also very poor learning outcomes. In terms of tertiary, the gross tertiary enrollment ratio was found to be about 15%. And that was also very low. And we have less than 40% of the lecturers with terminal degrees. And the funding gap in tertiary education is about 45%. So the ESP was launched based on these results, and some reforms have been introduced. I want to mention some of the reforms. So we have curriculum and assessment framework reform. And with this, we have introduced the national standardized test, which is taking data in terms of student performance. We are doing proficiency tests for students in primary 2, primary 4, and primary 6. With regards to the primary 2 data, I must say that there has been an improvement from 2% to 38%. That is as at 2021. However, these figures are representing only the public schools. The private schools are doing very well, but we realize that if we don't work on the public schools, the whole system will grind to a halt. So that is why we are very much interested in that. Then we have teacher education reform. And with this, all teacher training colleges have been transformed from diploma awarding to degree awarding. We also have issues with teacher professionalism and development. And with that, we have introduced licensure examination where teachers will have to write an exam to be licensed. And every year, they are supposed to do CPDs, continuous professional development programs. We also have new school inspection framework called NASIA, and they also go from one school to the other to make sure that they are picking the data which all have an input into the National Strategic Plan for Education. We have tertiary education reform. We have CTVET reform. Then we have the secondary education reform, which is free SHS, and which has allowed a lot of students to be able to access free education. Previously, 800,000 students nationwide were enrolled in secondary education. After the introduction of the free SHS program, which is a flagship program of the current president, the numbers have increased to 1.2 million. So at any time, we have about 1.2 million students nationwide attending secondary school. Then we have ICT in education also introduced, and then we have the Education Regulatory Bodies Act also introduced. All these were possible because we were able to gather data, and this data was gathered from the education sector reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to highlight, as some of you can see on the side screens, that we've got Slido operating. So anyone who has a device in the room who would like to log on to Slido, please feel free to type in any questions there. And you can also use it to upvote the questions that are already there, so I know which one has the most interest in the room when it comes to our discussion point. So it's a pleasure for me to now introduce our fourth and final panelist, Dr. Molukan Nigatu Bekele. Dr. Bekele is the Chief Executive of the Teachers and Education Leaders Development in Ethiopia. And we would love to hear from you as well about how evidence and data is used to shape government policy in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. And I'm almost the same with the previous speakers that this call was a surprise. And I only know yesterday evening that I will be here. But I'm happy to be here in this historic university in this beautiful town. So saying this, before I go to the question, before I go to the details, let me tell you the story, a short story of mine. When I first assumed this position as a CEO of Teachers and Educational Leaders Development, the first thing I did was to call a meeting with all staff and ask them the number of teachers we have in Ethiopia, the number of teachers we have in, the number of educational leaders we have in Ethiopia, and even the number of schools we have from K to 12. So there were about 5 to 6 experts in the area, but all of them, the answers they gave me was different for all of them. One say, I think it is around 500,000, like that. The other said, I think it's around 550 or around that. The other say 6. Everybody said, I think. I think it is like that. Then I asked, where can I get this data, exact data of schools, teachers, or educational leaders? And they told me that it is from EMIS department. EMIS, for those of you who are not familiar, is its Educational Management Information System. We have it in our ministry. And I went there to ask for this data. And the person I got at that time, he said, I think it is 700, around that, 700,000, around that. So if you put I think in front of the sentence, that's just enough. So if a journalist may come to my office and ask me the number of teachers, I'm a CEO for teacher development, and if a journalist comes and asks me, I can say, I think it is. So this comes out of poor data management we have in the ministry. I can say that boldly, and we have a consensus on that. We have EMIS, and we have also HEMIS. HEMIS is a Higher Education Management Information System. We have that, but the way we collect data is poor. What you have on EMIS data and what you have on the ground is different. Someone has asked this question from the audiences. We tried to take some schools as a sample, random sampling, and we tried to cross-check the data in EMIS and the data on the ground in the schools, and it's completely different. So we have been using that data for planning, to prioritize our activities. We have been using that data to inform even our implementation, to make our implementation effective, but everything goes, when you look at how poor the data is, all what we have been doing is questionable. So, therefore, now as a ministry in the government, we have reached on consensus that our data management system, the way we collect data, particularly the way we organize them, the way we analyze those data should be changed. We have to modernize it. That is one thing. The other thing is we have to also detach data from politics. This is also raised from audiences. If politics interferes, I can use maybe medical word, the data would be contaminated. The schools, for many good reasons and bad reasons, they may underreport things, or sometimes they overreport it. If they believe that income is coming based on that report, they overreport, that also causes a problem. And therefore, what we are trying to do, particularly with the support of EDT, hats off for EDT really, they are helping us a lot that is an implementing entity for FCDO. We have a program with them that is D4D, data for delivery, and they are supporting us to generate evidences. One thing that we have started is a kind of pilot on 310 schools, and to have a real-time data from these schools based on by collecting information on tablets. And we have developed a software with the support we received from them. We developed a software that's a learning app, and we installed that app on that tablet, and we trained educational supervisors to collect data from these schools, so that whenever there are changes in the school, they fill information on the tablet, and we can see it at the ministry, at the central level. In that way, if we get enough support, we can reach out to as many schools as we can, so that we can get a real time. Unless otherwise, the data we have been gathering, the data we have been publishing is really questionable. And we are doing on that. We have now created a task force in the ministry to a district level, which clears up all the data we have, and to modernize the way we collect, we organize, and we analyze data. Therefore, this is the way how we are trying to create evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we'll come very shortly to your questions, but we're very privileged as well this afternoon to have on the panel with us Mr. Wasim Ashmal Chowdhury. Mr. Chowdhury is the Secretary of the Ministry for Federal Education in the Government of Pakistan, and is very involved in some of the measures that are being taken there to improve education quality. I'm sure you have many comments, but if I could be unfair and just frame one for you, but please feel free to comment more widely. It strikes me, listening to our four very different reflections, that Rukmini talked really about using data to raise attention, that David talked about using data to inform policy, that Mark talked about using data to track performance, and that Mulukli talked about using data to drive and manage the system. So we have these different uses of data to grab attention, to drive performance improvement, to change the system, and to inform policy. I'd be really interested in your reflections from your deep experience on which of those has had the greatest success and has the greatest import at times of change, as well as any broader reflections you have.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. When I was listening to the honorable members of the panel, and when I was looking at the topic of the panel discussion today it's from data to innovation. So that's what I was trying to find out, that how does data actually leads towards some kind of innovation. So we have heard that we can track performance, we can find out various disaggregated forms to make policies more responsive to those issues and challenges. But the point is, does it really lead towards innovation, or the innovation is dependent upon data? So my reflections on that would be that if we look at the data, I'm always reminded that 2 + 2 is 4. But whenever I go to a leadership class or management class, they would tell me that you are not a successful leader if you don't actually have the ability to come up with 2 + 2 is equal to 5. There is something intangible in the organizations, within the systems run by the human beings, which somehow cannot be traced by data. Where is the motivation? Where is the will? Where is the passion? We tend to, the data would tell us all those kids who are not in the school, out of school children, perhaps they are not learning anything. But we all know they are doing something in their life. Even if they are working in the fields or working as children, in the, as child laborers, they learn something from the life. And at each point when a child struggles to interact with his environment around, whether it's family, friends, or school environment, he's learning something. But that cannot be documented in that sense. So what I'm trying to highlight over here is that all those data sciences, all that logical inference, and all that, analysis, even based upon various econometric models, where we assume a lot of things to be constant, may not lead towards the right kind of conclusions. And sometimes we have to think out of the box. And that box perhaps does not have that kind of data available with us. And this is where the innovation comes in. And I was, listening towards very carefully the discussion we had in the previous session, that how actually the COVID, which actually, created a lot of problems and disrupted all the learning continuity, but simultaneously, it was that necessity which created a lot of such, alternate methods and means that we could perhaps were not utilizing in the past. Suddenly the debate shifted towards, learning outcomes. The entire paradigm of educational debate prior to COVID was perhaps more towards outputs. And suddenly it shifted towards then outcomes. So if I would like to, focus the most important thing, in this panel, that yes, evidence matters. Yes, as Federal Secretary, I'm, heavily relying upon data, and we will create those EMIS systems, their integration, their analysis, and all that. But perhaps all that only appeals to what we call the left brain kind of analysis, and where is the right brain analysis? How do I know that a child sitting in a class whom we say that he is, behind that grade, he cannot read, perhaps he's, having some kind of dyslexia issues? So our diagnostic tools will not, tell me that how many kids in the class are suffering from the slow learning issues. And perhaps what I'm trying to stretch is that the frontiers of the data and all the logic attached to it may not be the ultimate truth in the sense, although, because there are much more wider dimensions of knowledge, and if I could, stretch the debate towards the epistemology of knowledge, where we all know there are limitations of rationality, which we can perhaps apply on the human learning, human behavior, and many other things. And that is why there comes some kind of a folk wisdom, Some of our teachers in the, and even educational managers in the past, when the data was not around, they were still very good managers. And they were still, producing a very high class scholars or learners, that even we all know some of the outliers, even in the data sciences like Bill Gates or, many other such stories, Einstein, who were dropped out of schools. But then, they ultimately, were found to be the biggest learners in this, in the entire paradigm. And some of those kids who were, performing very, highly within the schools were not ultimately found to be better learners in that. But that doesn't undermine the relevance of the data, the support which it gives to the policy makers to understand the situation better. What I'm trying to highlight over is that there are always other factors also, intangibles, what we say, that if we want to change a situation, if we want to, kind of bring a shift even in the learning paradigm, it's not only the data. There are many other situations, intangibles, which have to be observed. Perhaps they can be better, perceived, and perhaps they can be better felt, I mean, how can I really understand that if a child really is performing well in a music class, or, what kind of, perceptions or, feelings or, expertise or skills are really, required for a learner in the music class. So, I mean, this is something, my reflections on that. And just to add whatever the colleagues have said, that this is also another dimension that the innovation would definitely require you to think beyond it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, thank you, Wasim. One of the dangers of asking someone to be a discussant is that they might fervently agree with all of the previous speakers. So I'm very grateful to Wasim for adding a little spice to our discussion, and I can already see all of my panelists want to respond to his intervention. So, Rukmini, do you want to kick off, and then we'll come to you, Mark?
So I think Wasim Saab has provided a very good public service by reminding us what the title of this panel is, Data to Evidence in Education from Data to Innovation. And while I don't disagree with many things that my neighbor and others have said, I do think there are quite simple ways in which at least we in India have used data to move to solutions. I don't know what an innovation is, but I can tell you what a solution is. So if you look at the very simple USR data that is produced, can children read letters, words, a small paragraph, or a story? And just think of that aggregated over, our surveys have 700,000 children in them, and you can break it down by district level or by state level. But it's just exactly that simple data that my headman got all worked up about for his village. School systems, at least in our part of the world, are organized by age and grade. So if you think of a table, a very simple table, which puts this data out, if you go across a row, that's 3rd grade or 4th grade or 5th grade. And then there are columns which say what number or proportion of children are at each of these levels. And so when the USR data was first put out, not just in India, but in many of the countries, including in East Africa, you could see that in every grade, there is several things. This is just 3 lines of data. Every grade has huge variation, and this variation is across all the grades. At the last column, if you say a story level is roughly, at least in India, a 2nd grade level, then year after year we see that it's only at 20% or a 30% or lower, which means that A, there is very low learning levels. 2, year on year, it's not changing. 3, there is huge variation in the classroom. And if I look across grades, it shows me that there is very little value add year on year. This is all from 3 lines of data and 5 columns, which I can do at the district level or at the state level. And what this led us to think about is, one is how do you get more kids into the last column, which is at least basic foundational literacy. Second is how do you help teachers to deal with this variation in their classroom. One of the toughest things that I find, even as a teacher, is teaching children in one class who are at 5 different levels. This is one of the biggest challenges that teachers have. And then there is an overambitious curriculum that is riding over all of this, which is perhaps creating the problem. So the solution that we've tried, and which now, thanks to the World Bank and FCDO, has been put in a great buy, thank you very much, because when you put these things in these big fat reports, then we can proudly say, oh, you see, they said it's okay. Sometimes locally it is not recognized as okay. When Halsey said that there is a learning crisis in the world, everybody said there's a learning crisis in the world. But the 15 years before that, when we were saying it's a learning crisis, they were saying citizen-led assessments. Okay? So this answers the local and the international question that he asked. Anyway, but going back to this, what we decided is that our systems don't have extra resources. I can't say bring lots of extra teachers to teach in the class. So all that was done in teaching at the right level is instead of the 3 teachers teaching each their rows with the huge variation, think about the columns, and the 3 teachers in the school now divide for just an hour or 2 a day and teach. So one teacher teaches those who are at beginner or letter level, another teacher teaches those who are at word level, and a 3rd teacher deals with the kids who are a little bit more advanced, can read paragraphs or stories. 2 hours a day, 60, 70 days, 25, 30, 35 percentage points improvement. And all from this one little table at which you can look at the variation, the level, the change over time. So I do think that there are some simpler problems I agree with you. I don't know how to measure creativity, collaboration, curiosity, but can children read and how can we help them to read? I think simple data, which everybody understands, can be quite powerful in leading to solutions that can be effective.
Thank you so much. Mark, you want to come in?
Thank you very much. I think the way the question was asked probably made us all go on a particular tangent. In terms of solutions, we have come up with some solutions. One of such solutions is what we call the Communities of Excellence program. So we have launched this program, which is going to involve the community leaders, because now major issues that we have identified include teacher accountability. We've also looked at learning outcomes. We are looking at these communities of excellence where the community leadership, from politicians to the chiefs, because our systems are different, are all involved in the running of the schools. So in this case, we are making sure that teachers are made accountable to what they are supposed to do. We are making sure that teachers are being trained. We are making sure that the kids are also being tested from time to time, because hitherto, testing of the students only occurred at age 15 nationwide. Now we are doing testing at primary 2, primary 4, primary 6, and then we will be bringing the various interventions that are necessary. We've also launched what we call the National Education Leadership Institute, where teachers are going to be trained. And we are going to have a nationwide program where teachers from time to time will go for training programs, where teachers on a monthly basis will have to block time out on a timetable and get the training done. So there are a lot of these solutions and interventions that have been put in place to address the problems that we are seeing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to take us now to some of our questions, and perhaps some of our other participants would like to help to contribute to these. So one that we were asked very early on by Shamaki was about displaced people and refugees in education systems. And I don't know if any of our panelists feel able to say a little bit about that. The question, I think, expanded to how we gather data on those individuals and how we can support them even at a time when their lives are in chaos and it may be very hard to gather their data or know where they come from an education perspective. But I don't know if any of our panelists have an observation or comment on those experiences. Please, David.
Because Kenya has done a lot in as far as integrating refugees is concerned. And in 2019, the government came up with a policy on how to integrate all children who are within the boundaries, the borders of Kenya, into education. And today, any child who sits for their primary school exam in Kenya is placed in our secondary schools without any discrimination. They also benefit from scholarships, just like other learners. The challenge mainly with the refugee education is about 3 issues. One, data. Because, as my colleague from Ethiopia said, if you go to the UNHCR and you want data on the refugees, you will have one set of data different from the data that exists with other government organizations. The second challenge is about their transitions into and back into their countries. Sometimes the children come without English. If they're coming from Sudan, most likely they will have done their studies in Arabic. If they're coming from Somalia, maybe the same thing will happen. And so they take a long time to settle down and start learning meaningfully. And then at the point when they are going back to their countries, maybe they have learnt in English in Kenya. Now they're going back to countries where the language of instruction is different. So that's another big challenge. The other challenge, and which has started to emerge, is where there's a lot of promise to them from the global north that they'll be integrated into those countries, and therefore they don't concentrate because they are living with this ideal that they are not going to be here for long. They are moving to those other countries. So all these challenges require, of course, a lot of interventions based on innovations. And I'm not sure there's enough research going on in these refugee camps to inform how we should deal with them.
Thank you so much. May I come to Mulukan? We'll just come to you in just a minute, Osei. Mulukan?
Yeah.
I think there was another question asked.
Sorry, Osei, I was just going to let Mulukan come to this one, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Just, I think he has touched it anyways, but to capitalize on what has been said regarding the refugees and displaced people, let alone them in Ethiopia, we have so many out-of-school children due to different crises. The COVID is one thing, we have been in war, and there are so many crises. But we work with 3 to 4 development partners regarding out-of-school children particularly. And the data we have from these 4 development partners is different, totally different. Some is exaggerated, some others are just... So, what we have done is we have created a pool where they can be merged in order to avoid duplication of both resource and effort also. So in that case, every institution is not expected to go out and assess, come up with a different data. Rather, they have to merge the resources they have, the data they have, so that we can help. It is the same with the displaced and the refugee people. There are so many NGOs, so many development partners, but they have, I can say they are helping us, but they have also a different interest. So due to that, we are not effectively incorporating this issue of displaced and refugee people. So in that way, maybe now we are planning to integrate them to the host community. The other problem is lack of, we are not able to measure their prior learning. Most of them have prior learning, but because we don't have national qualification framework in our country, we are not able to measure their prior knowledge and place them in the appropriate grades they should be. So we are working on that anyways.
Thank you so much. Awesome.
Another question perhaps could not be written on the screen is that that was regarding those areas which are at different socio-political level, and how can we incorporate the needs of those areas into the educational needs of those areas can be addressed. So I think Israr from Pakistan had asked this question, so I did want to reply to his question that obviously, those areas where there is already, what are they lagging in, different development indicators, their priorities and their, educational needs have to be responded in their devolved and in their decentralized way of planning and budget allocations. So as we devolve and decentralize planning at the local level, only then their issues or their needs can be addressed. They cannot be addressed at the provincial or at the federal level. And secondly, again, here it's where the data also again plays a very important role, that how do we actually measure those indicators through which we understand that a particular district is lagging behind or not. And the allocation of resources could be made in a way that more resources are employed to those regions who have left behind, instead of investing more and more in those areas where in terms of efficiency or in terms of we could have more gains. So maybe here it is where the role of the public sector or the public education becomes much more important. And these are the ways through which we can actually address the needs of those areas.
Thank you. I want to build on that question, if I may, Wasim, because the broader question of how evidence can excuse me, deal with the politicisation of education policy seems really critical. And what you've just described is a very big allocative decision. And clearly in any country, allocating more resource to one area, even on the basis of deprivation, will be highly contested. So I think it was Adam's original question. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to respond to how data can be used to somewhat depoliticise or at least allow for a more sustained approach to education policy.
I think the example I want to give is that some data needs to be used to, maybe politicization is not the right word, but bring to the attention of politicians and policymakers that this is an area which needs urgent attention. So it's a bit of reverse of what you're asking. If I look at the role that this ASER data has played in India, one of the reasons that it was designed the way it was so that it persistently we will measure something and hopefully it will have an impact. So the data gathering is done at the household level, so it covers all children. We never did, the whole country has to be covered, so 600 districts every year, predictably, and you get, in the early years, nobody believed the data, then there's been a whole set of things that have happened. But the one thing that has happened without fail is every year between the 15th and the 18th of January, the report will be published and it will be out there. And I think it has taken, from 2005 till 2020 for it to be actually in the national policy. And I'm not saying it's only this that has happened, but the fact that, access to some extent or to a large extent in India has been solved. And really it is this learning business that has to be tackled. In a way, it took, a lot of data and a lot of effort and, many other things to get it into the heads of policymakers that this is an important thing that has to be very high national priority. So for the first time in India, 2020, we have not the first time, the new education policy in 2020 actually has a paragraph in it which says that if foundational literacy and numeracy is not achieved by grade 3 in the next 5 years, the rest of the policy is irrelevant. So I think these are, how does policy get formed there are many things I'm sure, but I think persistent, regardless of everything that is happening in the world, doing a set of data collection done by citizens in every district of the country, I think to me can play a significant role in shaping policy.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I would like to add some more perspective into it. Because in Pakistan, we have tried many times. The spending on the education is always a low priority, despite the fact that there is a mandatory clause in the constitution that the state shall guarantee education to up to from 5 years to 16 years of children. And despite this mandatory clause, the politicians have not been, responding to the needs of the education. Why is that? Because, in a resource-starved economy, it's not only the education which is, which needs finances. There are many other competing sectors. And for a politician, whether it's important to build a road in his area, or whether to provide a water supply scheme, or whether to go for, housing or anything else, he or she has to decide that how many voters would actually respond towards this kind of a demand. Although we all know that the education is a kind of public good and majority of the voters should respond to that, but it's a fact that, and there are studies on that, that the demand on the education does not accumulate in that sense. The way the demand of any other commodity would, in the economic sense, would accumulate, and supply would, automatically be, dependent on that. So there is something, the demand accumulation of education has to be strengthened. And we have experimented that before the elections, there were big messages coming, and even, at this point in time, with the help of World Bank, we are trying to come up with messages, more allocation for the education emergency. All those slogans somehow would, evaporate once there are hardcore political realities which the politicians have to face in terms of their constituencies and in terms of their political, priorities.
Thank you. I'm going to allow Mark, who got my eye first, one last minute, and then I'm sorry, we're just going to have to cut there if that's
Yes,
all right.
and
Mark,
yes, to add to all that has been said, in Ghana, we have the Parliamentary Select Committee on Education, and you can always make representations to them and then go argue your case, even though you are not very sure whether you can get through. But once you are able to also get stakeholders involved, you can have stakeholder consultations, and you also meet the Parliamentary Select Committee on Education. Thank you.
You were so quick, Muluken can have 30 seconds that you've left him.
30 seconds?
Yes, 30 seconds.
Maybe just on politicization of data, a simple word. That was our biggest problem in Ethiopia, because there used to be unhealthy competition between regions, across regions. Ethiopia is a federal government composed of 11 different regions, and there was unhealthy competition among the regions. The data we have on the passing students, the promoting students from grade to grade is amazing. It's around 98, 99%. But this year we did national exam, and on that national exam we were very strict. And we made all grade 12 students to go to universities and take their exam there, and with strict supervision. It used to be 60-70%, 7-0. It used to be 60 to 70% pass some 3-4 years. But now, only, for your surprise, only 3.2 students passed. That means they get 50% and above. So you look how we have been faked with the data, and all our plans, all our activities, maybe that is why I said all our activities were questionable with that data. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really sorry to have to draw things to a close. I know there are many more questions, but on your behalf, I want to thank our panel so much for their rich and varied contributions this evening. I think each of them touched on the different audiences who have an interest in data. We heard about the accountability side for parents and for communities. We heard about the importance of influencing political leaders so that education goes to the top of the agenda. And then we heard from these distinguished panelists who have each in their own way contributed significantly to the improvement of education in their country as to how policymakers and those running the system need reliable data. And I think it's important to remember all of those areas. I'm certainly going away challenged to be more focused on how we can get innovation right, thank you, Wasim, but also with 3 words in my mind about the kind of data we need. We need data that's persistent, we need data that's universal, and we need data that's independent. And if we can strive for those things, we can provide the kind of basis that each of our panelists have alluded to that allows us to drive further improvement in our education systems and ultimately better outcomes from our learners, which I know is what animates us all. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.